Welcome back to the Burrowshire podcast. I'm Brandon Vaught. I'm here with Father Blake Britton, my best friend. He is sitting underneath, I don't know if you can quite see it right behind his head, a big cardboard cutout of there it is, his new book, Reclaiming Vatican II. It's a giant oversized cutout. I don't believe that's the large print version, Father Blake, but maybe you can confirm.
It is not the large print version. I don't know if we're going to have to make one of those or not. But yeah, it was really cool. It was really cool to receive it's just like a cutout promo thing that Ave Maria Press does. And Ave's been so amazing. They're a great publishing company and they're just wonderful to work with. And so it was really cool to get that in the mail and to actually have something physical to say, okay, this book is not just a figment of my imagination. It's actually going to be printed, and here's a cutout of it. So I'm very excited for that to be released in October. It's available for pre-order now if anybody wants to go to AveMariaPress.com and to order it. And we're just really excited to share that with you. And we'll have a podcast, of course, on the book as we get closer to the release date. But it is an exciting endeavor. The Lord is good. The Lord is good.
I remember you texted me a photo of it when it came, and you had it like that big cardboard cutout on your desk or something, and it was next to, I don't know, your mouse or something. So the scale was evident. It was huge. And I remember thinking like, what is that? I'm like, I wanted it, but I didn't want to like criticize it. So I was like, it looks a little bigger than I was expecting. I don't, it's like 2 feet by 1.5 feet. But hey, maybe that's where the publishing world's going. I don't know.
Well, that's when I say to Brandon, I'm like, oh, I didn't tell you it's a picture book. I'm not really into the whole writing thing, but.
All right, well, let's move on to the topic of discussion today, which is shame. Shame. We've gotten a lot of emails about this topic, and I know both of us have had friends bring this up in the past. It's one of those topics that doesn't get a lot of coverage, but I think it is a burning issue for a lot of especially younger people. We'll get into why that is. Just to maybe spoil it a little bit, I think the internet culture has amplified this culture of shame. People are shamed online a lot. They're either on the receiving end or the sending end of that shame. Also, things like social media have put the spotlight on people that are successful in the realm of, financially successful, physically successful at work or family life. And that has engendered a lot of shame among other people thinking, why am I not as good as that person, or why am I lacking in this way? So shame. We're going to cover this from a couple different angles here. So first of all, we want to talk about shame in the spiritual life. What role does shame play, both for good and for evil? Where does it come from? How do we deal with shameful feelings, either about our physical body or our soul, our spiritual life, our interior? So that'll be the first part of the discussion. But then the second part, we'll move on to the shame culture, especially online, how the internet has fueled this culture of shaming, what to do about it, how to respond to being shamed. So I think many of us here have had experiences, usually on social media, where people will gang up on you in the comment boxes or on any number of social media platforms. How does a Christian deal with that? What's the Christian response to shaming? So that's what we're going to be talking about here. But Father Blake, first things first, always begin by defining our terms as good philosophers do. So what is shame?
Yes, to find a good Christian definition, we'd have to go back to Thomas Aquinas, who actually quotes John Damascene and Gregory of Nyssa in his Summa Theologica. So according to Aquinas, quoting Gregory and John, he says, shame is fear of doing a disgraceful deed or of a disgraceful deed that has already been done. So once again, shame is fear of doing a disgraceful deed or of a disgraceful deed that has already been done. And we know what that's like. So we do something that maybe someone finds out about publicly. We do something that's maybe been publicized outside of our own realm of authority, again, through social media, internet, something like that. And we feel that shame deep within our gut because we regret what has been done, either because it was a very evil thing that was done that we're properly embarrassed about because it's an evil, or it's something that was private. And we'll get into that in a moment when we talk about St. John Paul II, the positive notion of shame as the protection of something within the realm of privacy. But that would be Thomas Aquinas, again, quoting John Damascene and Gregory of Nyssa. That would be his understanding of shame.
It seems to me shame falls in the same general category as guilt. And we often think of guilt and shame in negative terms, that these are bad things and we should avoid ever feeling guilty or shameful. But I think what you see in that definition from John Damascene and Gregory is it can have a positive dimension often, just like guilt can, because like guilt, when you feel a conviction of guilt, it's because you did something wrong. And shame is what you feel when you've done something disgraceful, similar, but
Right.
a little different than something wrong. But that's a good thing. That's a good reaction. That means you're functioning in a healthy way, that when you do something you should not have done, you feel guilty about it first, and then you would feel shameful if someone else found out about it, if you were disgraced by it. So let's spend a little bit more time on that positive
Yeah.
element. Maybe say a little bit more about the positive dimension of shame.
Sure, sure. So on the spiritual level, you have the positive notion insofar as you just mentioned it. The fact that when something evil or something disgraceful is done, we feel shame because that is the innate goodness of our soul, recognizing a corruption of reality, a corruption of a good. Remember that we are all made in God's likeness and image. This is a fundamental principle of Catholicism, that nothing in and of itself, in its very existence, is evil. Evil is non-being, or the lack of being. It does not possess being in and of itself. So things down at the very nature are good, including human persons. At the very core of our being, we are good creatures that desire good. Now, we may desire good in incorrect, shameful ways, as Augustine will say, which is sin. But in the end, even sin is committed because we believe that we're seeking or acquiring a good. So you have that spiritual sense of the positive side of shame, that if you are ashamed, that's a good thing insofar as it's pointing towards the fact that you have goodness within your soul. And I always point that out to people when they come to me in confession, covered in shame. And that is something that's very key to people who come to the sacrament of reconciliation. They're so shameful of what they've done. And I always share with them, that's beautiful. That means you have a heart. That means you have a soul. So there's that positive aspect of shame. And then St. John Paul II, in his Theology of the Body, specifically his wonderful book, Love and Responsibility, it's a bit weighty, so I warn our listeners and viewers, if you try to read it, it's definitely a trudge, but it's worth it. It's worthy to go through those trenches. And in that book, he defines shame also as this result of fallen nature to protect that which can be manipulated, exploited, or abused. So he relates it immediately to human nakedness. So after the fall of man, they are naked with shame. Before they were naked without shame, now they're naked with shame. The reason why shame is introduced into human existence is to protect humanity from the mistreatment of another. And when that intimacy, when that privacy is unduly exploited, then we feel shame, because we know that something intimate, something that's deep within our souls, that should only be between ourselves and God, or ourselves and a very specific group of people, has now been opened up for the whole world to see. So shame also comes along in that regards, and in a positive sense. So it's this feeling of protecting that, or keeping close to the chest those things that are private. Now, in the negative aspect of shame, and this is where most people have struggles, shame can become an evil, can become misused when we feel shame from looking at sin or looking at failure outside of the context of divine mercy. And this is where you have people with debilitating shame who fall into depression, fall into anxiety. Some people will go into suicidal thoughts. It's because they're looking at their failure, or maybe they're looking at something private that's been publicly exposed unduly or disrespectfully. They're looking at it only as a tragic event, but not in the context of divine mercy and love. And we'll elaborate on what that means to look at sin, to look at our own shame, or to look at something private that's been violated in the context of divine mercy and love in a few more minutes. But those would be the two sides of the positive nature and the negative nature of shame.
I want to spend just a little bit more time here on the positive nature of shame, because it strikes me that, say, over the past decade or two, there's been an aggressive push to get rid of shame in our culture. The title of
Yes.
one of the best, most watched shows of the last decade is called Shameless. And I think
Right.
you see across the culture this move to become guilt-free, become shameless. Previous behaviors that people would have been ashamed of are now normalized and encouraged to be totally fine. Everybody behaves how they want. You should do what you want without fear of guilt or shame. It strikes me that the problem with this is it'd be like a building getting rid of all of its fire alarms. Like, yeah, fire alarms can be bad when there's a fire raging and there's this annoying sound that's just blaring in your ears. And if you wanted to get rid of that sound, you have two options. One, you can put out the fire, or two, you can get rid of all the fire alarms. But if you get rid of all the fire alarms, you're not really making your life any better. In fact, you're making it more dangerous, because now the dangers of the fire are prevalent and hidden and unaddressed. I think shame operates in most people's lives in a similar way. When we feel that tinge of shame in our life, our first impulse is to repress it. We want to tell ourselves, or we listen to the voice of the enemy telling us, you're not that bad, or that action wasn't that bad, or that thing you're embarrassed about, you don't really have to be that embarrassed about it. Like we try to quell the shame. We try to turn down the fire alarm. If that doesn't work, then we have the same two options as the person in the building with the fire. We can either just become completely shameless, or we can address the thing that's bringing us shame.
Yes.
But the point I'm trying to make in all this is that the shame itself is not the problem. The shame is the alert. It's the fire alarm. It's telling you that there's a problem, and you want that thing to be working. You want a well-functioning shame alert, if you will, because that's key to the interior life.
Yes. And again, it points to the fact that something which is good is being corrupted, or something which is good is being taken advantage of. Something that is good is being misused or misappropriated. That is very important for authentic human happiness and for genuine progression of civilization, to be able to recognize when things are going awry. And if you remove those parameters, then we go downhill at 90 miles per hour with no brakes, as we're doing right now. And you see, I think, a juxtaposition to that, Brandon, along with Pride, quote unquote, month, or the Pride, quote unquote, movement. The fact that there's nothing to be proud of in living a lifestyle that contradicts human nature. There's nothing to be proud of in promoting a lifestyle that is egotistical, or in promoting a lifestyle that's against the dignity of human sexuality. This is not a source of human pride. It's actually a very, again, shameful thing. But yet we've now redefined the notion of pride, and we've taken what should be sinful, that should be seen as this mistreatment of the dignity of human sexuality, and held it up on a pedestal. And the same thing is now taking place, where you see the degradation of the human person, the mistreatment of human persons, even to the point of the legalization of mutilation of human bodies through transgenderism. And that is being applauded, and now they're trying to subsidize it through our own tax dollars. So it's just fascinating to me that they could take these kinds of terms, that people will take these kinds of terms because there's conflict within the soul that's unresolved, and they try to redefine them to quell that conscience. And we really have to work to regain the dignity of shame, the dignity of conscience, the dignity of guilt, the dignity of humility and true pride in being good as opposed to pride in being bad. All those sort of things are important for human culture, and of course for sainthood, for Catholicism.
Let's talk a little bit about where shame comes from, where it originates. I think if you asked most people on the street, they would probably give some answer, or they would answer something like, shame is a cultural construct. It's basically whatever the culture around us thinks is bad is projected onto each individual and makes them feel shameful for not living in accord with what the culture believes is good. For us, though, for us Catholics, we recognize shame, it does have a cultural dimension. Yeah, you can feel shameful because of the cultural norms around you, but shame ultimately comes from a person, a voice. Now, we mentioned earlier how it could come from a good voice. It could come from the voice of your own conscience, which is the voice of Christ within you. Shame could be alerting you to something awry within your own soul, but in my experience, more often than not, that shame comes from a different voice. Who is that, Father Blake?
Satan, the evil one. That word Satanas, even going back to the Hebrew, means the accuser, or the false one, the liar. And that is the voice that's very constantly active in shame. So Ignatius of Loyola will say in his spiritual exercises, there are constantly three voices at work in our lives: the voice of the Father, the voice of God, our voice, and then the voice of the enemy. And they're always vying for our attention. So our voice is always in unity with one of those two voices. And we have to discern which one we're in unity with. Are we in unity with the evil one or unity with Christ? Now, I think there's a beautiful passage in sacred scripture that helps clarify how the enemy works and how the enemy sees reality versus how Christ works and how he sees reality, and then our place in between. And that's Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 23. And this is the interaction between Peter, after he makes his very famous Petrine confession, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And now Jesus makes his prediction about the crucifixion in Jerusalem. Peter responds, "God forbid that that should happen. God forbid that that should happen." So what you have here is the crucifixion being held up before these two men, Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh, and Peter, our first pope. The same exact reality, but they're being looked at in two totally different ways, and Jesus will point that out. "Get behind me, Satan, for you are thinking as man does, not as God does." So what you see here is the same reality now interpreted through two totally different perspectives. One is a satanic perspective. The other one is a divine Christic perspective. So in the eyes of Satan and the satanic sinful perspective, the crucifixion is an absolute tragedy. There's nothing valorous about it. It is ugly. It is brutal. It is disgusting. It's murderous. It's something to be ran away from. And that's how Peter's interpreting it. He's seeing the crucifixion only from the world's eyes, only according to the eyes of the enemy, which this is a disgusting, horrid thing that sin wins and evil wins through the crucifixion. Then you have Christ, who of course is seeing it from the perspective of the Trinity. The cross in the eyes of the Trinity is not something horrific. It is the very means by which that which is horrific is taken away. It is the healing of the horrific through divine mercy and through sacrificial love. And so in this, once again, in the single reality, you see these two radically different perspectives of the crucifixion, one being true because it's being seen in the light of sacrificial love and divine mercy, the other false because it's being seen in the shadow of tragedy, hatred, and sin. The same happens in our spiritual lives. Anytime that we sin, anytime that we fail, anytime that we have a shortcoming, we can either see it through the eyes of Christ or see it through the eyes of the enemy. Satan will always work to make us see our sin in isolation. He's like putting a blinder on a horse. So if your sin is right here, like this circle that I'm making with my hand, he's going to consume your entire world with that sin. So now your world becomes pitch black because he's holding it so close to you that you can't see anything else. And that's where you have people spiraling into anxiety, shame, depression, guilt. They start saying, well, my life is horrible. I can't believe that I did that. I can't believe this has happened in my life. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. All these kind of pessimistic mentalities. It's because the enemy is making us look at sin strictly close up in isolation from the action and the grace of God. Whereas the Spirit, the goodness of Christ, the baptismal grace of the church, the sacramental life of the church, allows us to see sin in its true reality and perspective, which, if we look at sin in face value, in the light of divine mercy, it's actually a very small thing. And in the eyes of Christ, it's actually opportunity. Where we see sin, Christ sees grace waiting to happen. Where we see failure, Christ sees redemption blooming. Where we see falling away from God, Jesus sees a rocket ship to God, this thing that shoots us straight into the Sacred Heart. That's the whole reason why after the resurrection, he keeps his wounds. This is a testament to each and every one of us that he is now incorporated. He has integrated woundedness, integrated brokenness, integrated failure into the divine life, into the Trinity, so that now that which was horrific, that which separated us from God, namely death, murder, hatred, violence, sin, now becomes, through his mercy, if it's given to him and surrendered to him, the very avenue of communion with God. And that's, of course, what the sacrament of reconciliation is all about. You go to this sacrament, you confess your sins, and that which was the object of your shame becomes the object of your virtue, becomes your boast. And that's why St. Paul will say, I willingly boast of my weaknesses, for in Christ I am made strong. Where sin is great, grace abounds all the more. There's a divine perspective of looking at sin as opposed to looking at it through the eyes of Satan.
It's like St. Paul's perspective is the complete opposite of the shame-based perspective, that I willingly boast of my sins. Like shame says, I hope nobody finds out about my sins. Like I don't want anybody to know about it. I'm ashamed to even go to the confessional and tell the priest about my sins. But Paul's perspective is the God-infused perspective, where he doesn't have the blinders on. He's not just looking at where I failed. He's been opened up to the broader perspective of Christ's mercy and love in light of that sin. And that light is so overwhelmingly blinding that he's no longer cramped within that shameful, self-enclosed corner.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And this is how people become joyful even amidst their brokenness. Those people are called saints. You see the saints that, of course, they don't push sin aside. It's not like sin doesn't exist. Oh, it doesn't matter. God loves me no matter what. Of course, that's foolishness. It's not right to say that. But at the same time, there is a kind of lightheartedness, which was a virtue that the ancient church fathers spoke about regularly, this virtue of lightheartedness, of being able to see reality in the perspective of divine mercy and divine love. That's a virtue we no longer have. We don't have the virtue of lightheartedness anymore, to be able to take things lightly. I love, of course, Chesterton's great quote, angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. That is so true of us. That's seeing things from a divine perspective, and it's very much necessary if we're to free ourselves from this shame culture. Now, secular society, and we will get to this in a moment when we talk about the internet crisis, sort of social media shame, but secular society, since it is not a Christological society any longer, since it doesn't have a concept of sacramental mercy, it does see failure, brokenness just in isolation. And that's why there's only one of two responses for secular society when it comes to shame, when it comes to failure or sin. And that is either embrace it wholeheartedly, be proud that you do this thing, be proud that you felt in this way, don't worry about it, don't let society tell you, or they suppress, circle in on themselves, try to sanitize it or to become numb to it through drug abuse, through pornography addiction, through clubbing every single night, through doing whatever they need to do to keep themselves desensitized to the real gravity of what's happening in their conscience. So those are the two responses that we see right now: hedonism, or this sense of let's just pretend like it's something of virtue. And neither of those, of course, in the end, satisfy the human heart.
Let's circle back to confession. I think shame and confession are linked for obvious reasons in many people's minds. But I know a lot of people, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, it's hard when you've committed a particularly egregious sin or a series of sins, or you're dealing with a sinful habit, and your shame alert is working. So it's convicting you of this deep sin. You're embarrassed by it. You're ashamed by it. You feel the sting of shame. It's hard to push yourself to go to confession, because the last thing you want to do when you clearly see some sin in your life is tell somebody else about it, including and especially a priest. So what would you say to people who, for them, the shame is just so overwhelming, they find it difficult, if not impossible, to drag themselves to the confessional?
Well, the first thing I'll say is you're not alone. I have a delightful and somewhat shameful, quote unquote, story of my own childhood, that among my first confessions, I intentionally sought a priest who only spoke Spanish so that he would not understand my confession. Now, I can't comment on the validity of that confession or that sacrament. I have since gone to valid confession, so I pray that the divine mercy embraces my childish shame and naivete. And even to add to that shame, I am Hispanic, but I just didn't speak in Spanish. And so you're not alone. I mean, that accompanies all of us. And again, that's because when we sin, we're looking at sin from our perspective. And that is not the perspective with which the priest nor Christ looks at your sin. So now I'm going to share what happens on the other side of that confessional. The majority of our listeners, they sit on one side. They're behind the screen, and they're just letting out these shameful things and worrying about what the priest is thinking. So let me tell you what the priest is thinking on the other side. At least I can say what this priest is thinking on the other side. One is, I've been amazed. By this point, I've heard the confessions of young children in the first reconciliation. I've also heard the confessions of gang members and prisoners. So I've heard the whole spectrum. And I've been amazed that no matter how grave, how seemingly atrocious and nasty and evil sin may be, I'm completely unfazed by it. It doesn't even disturb me in the least. Now, I thought it would be opposite before I became a priest. I thought for sure the first time that someone came in and confessed that they had done something, a crime, or they'd done an evil, that I would be like, oh man, what do I do? What do I say? I was amazed, and I'm convinced that it's the grace of ordination. I was amazed that the first time I heard some truly, truly dark sins, my heart was so at peace. And not only peace, there was actually an excitement and a joy that filled my soul. So I started praying with that. I'm like, Lord, where's that coming from? And I took that to spiritual direction. I spent holy hours before the Blessed Sacrament meditating on it. And I came to find through spiritual direction, that was the Sacred Heart of Jesus within me. I am a priest. I'm in persona Christi. That was the Spirit inflaming my heart with the love of Jesus and the excitement that he feels when a soul comes to him seeking his mercy. When you come with what from your perspective is ugly and is shameful and embarrassing, Jesus is overwhelmed with enthusiasm and joy, because now those things which were chains around your ankles and around your hands, he's able to break and you can fly. You're able to now leave that confessional and skyrocket to holiness. So that's what's really taking place within the context of that sacrament. I encourage you to take this to heart. All of you who may have shame about confession or even particular sin, the people joke around, especially my parishioners, they're like, you can go to Father Blake and say, Father, I just robbed a bank last night. And he would say, oh, that's beautiful. That's wonderful. Let's talk about it. And it's true. Every time someone confesses something, I'm like, that's so beautiful. That's so amazing. And they're like, Father, that's not beautiful and amazing. That's horrible. But of course, the sin itself is not beautiful and amazing, but the sin in light of Jesus's mercy is beautiful and amazing. Because what's about to happen when I give you absolution is that the wound which was filled with that infectious poison of shame and guilt is about to become an everlasting fountain of retribution and redemption. And that is beautiful. That is amazing. So I'm going to encourage all of us to really reflect and pray about what's actually transpiring within the confessional. I can promise you that priests are not sitting on the other side thinking, oh man, I mean, she did this and she's a Eucharistic minister, or he does that, and he sits in this pew, but doesn't even cross our minds. I promise. That's a lie from the enemy. So don't listen to that. The whole time, all that's filling the heart of the priest is just this humility, because I'm a sinner too. There's sins that I struggle with. So there's a humility in that Christ would choose a broken vessel to absolve one of my brothers and sisters. But also there's just overwhelming joy and pride. I'm so proud of my children when they own up to what they've done and they overcome the fear of shame so as to receive the joy of grace.
I'm so glad you said that. I think that'll be a balm to a lot of people, BALM, a balm to a lot of people listening to this, because the same voice, we all know this, the same voice that, here's the dynamic when it comes to sin. Before you commit a sin or before you're cognizant that you're caught in a habitual sin, the voice of the accuser is always one of license and permissiveness. Always say, oh,
Right.
go ahead and do it. It's not that bad. You'll be forgiven. It's not a big deal. It's just this minor little thing. But then you commit that sin. You take that action, or you say those words, or it's a sin of omission. You choose not to do that particular thing. And the moment you commit that act, the voice of the accuser switches. And
Yes.
then it's the voice pouring out this venom of shame. You're so terrible. How could you do that? This action is so egregious. What kind of person are you? I thought you were a good person, but this is so egregious.
Yeah.
But then I've noticed that it's that same voice that's projecting those words onto the priest waiting for you in the confessional. That same voice will tell you, don't even think about going to your pastor or to your parish priest to confess those sins, because that priest is going to unload all the shame onto you. That priest is going to be so ashamed of what you've done. But then, and this echoes what you just said, as soon as you get over that hurdle and go to confession, the moment you walk out of the door, that voice is gone. That voice has completely vanished. The whole conviction of shame floats away, and it's like that person, that voice that was accusing you, was eviscerated. They just disappear. And we all know this dynamic, because it happens every day, every time we sin, and yet it's still easy to listen to that voice and fall into that dynamic as if it's reality.
Yeah. I mean, Satan's got us trained like Pavlov's dog. I mean, he and again, that's because the enemy is an angelic creature. He's a twisted angelic creature, but he's a being of pure intellect nonetheless. So
And
he knows what buttons
much
to
higher
push.
intellect than us. A much higher intellect. He's Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking times a billion, and so
Right.
he can outsmart you. His intellect is far greater.
And that's why we have to thrust onto Christ. We have to know the machinations of the enemy. The enemy knows exactly how human nature works. He knows what buttons to press. He knows how to lead us and incline us towards certain sins. And as we've mentioned before, the enemy and demons in general do not have the ability to know what's in our mind or our heart. So they can't actually transpire what's happening within us internally. They don't have that ability, but they are masters of observation. They do have great deductive abilities because they're intellect. So again, think of like Sherlock Holmes times a million. They can draw patterns, connect dots, and they see that certain activities, that certain words, that certain phrases elicit particular responses. And so they'll try to weave and to mold temptations and responses according to those different reactions that they're able to manifest in you. We have to bypass all that by just running straight to the Sacred Heart. And St. Maria Faustina will talk about that over and over again, that in the end, don't even play the games. Don't play the games like, was that a sin? Was that not a sin? Am I really, run to the divine mercy, because the enemy is going to win that game every time. He's going to win that game every time. When we try to rationalize sin, we try to justify ourselves, or maybe we fall into scrupulosity and we call into some form of, failure. The enemy's always going to win that game. So the best thing we can do is thrust ourselves onto the divine mercy in the confessional and entrust our souls to the priest. And that way we know for sure we're living in grace.
All right, let's wrap up the first part of this discussion. Again, the first part here is shame in the interior life. The second part, we'll talk about shame in the general culture. But here's one more question that I've heard often. I think we've all asked this ourselves, is what do we do with shame over some shortcoming within us? Not necessarily a sin. So again, feeling shameful for committing a sin is partially good, partially bad. But what about a shame for a shortcoming? Maybe it's physical. We're ashamed about this or that part of our body. Maybe it's something we're ashamed about with our personality. I'm ashamed I'm not as extroverted, or I'm not as intellectual, or I'm not, whatever. Maybe it's something we're ashamed about with our identity. Maybe, our relationships or our family we're ashamed about, or whatnot. What do we do with this sort of shame that is tied to a shortcoming?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd encourage you all to do is go back and listen to our podcast on spiritual woundedness, because I'm able to go into a lot more detail there. Both of us are on wounds, lies, intervals, attitudes. Maybe we could even include the link on this podcast to that episode. So that episode will go a lot more in depth than I'm able to at this time. But I'll basically say this. I deal with this a lot in the confessional as well as in spiritual direction and just counseling with people. When it comes to weight, when it comes to skin color, when it comes to maybe a disability they have, dyslexia, ADHD, everybody has something that they're embarrassed about. They think that is a shortcoming. The first thing that we need to become convinced of is that there is nothing Jesus Christ has allowed that is against us. Nothing. St. Paul, letter to the Romans, if Christ is for me, what can be against me? All things work towards the good. What he's saying there is not that all things are necessarily easy, all things are necessarily pleasant and comfortable. What he's saying is no matter what happens in my life, if I give it to Christ, I trust that it will sanctify me. And that's the same thing with any of our maybe physical, psychological, or spiritual shortcomings. If I have a struggle with weight and I'm fighting with that, part of that drama, part of that struggle is what's going to sanctify you. If I have struggles with dyslexia, if I struggle with ADHD, or maybe I'm struggling with a particular addiction of pornography or what have you, the struggle itself is what's sanctifying. So it's not like I could be a saint if only this was deleted from my life and I had zero struggles. No, it's in the forge. It's in the fire of that tension of me trying to go on a diet and then failing for 2 days and then going back. It's the failure of I'm sober from pornography for 3 weeks and I fall one time. Or, I'm really good at biting my tongue and then I just snap and I curse someone out. Think of Jerome famously when he would carry around his rock with him and hit his chest because he had a very foul mouth. He would say cuss words a lot. And the Pope at his funeral actually took the stone and placed it on his casket. And this Pope was no fan of Jerome, by the way, because Jerome was very critical of him. But he placed the stone on the casket and he said, "My dear Jerome, if it was not for this stone, you would not be in heaven right now." And that was the Holy Father recognizing. It was in Jerome hitting his chest, and Jerome struggling with his foul mouth. It's in Augustine struggling with his lust. It's in Therese Lisieux struggling with her Jansenism and with her sense of self-hatred. It's in all these things that we become saints. So do not try to get rid of the drama of life. That's a very evil thing. We have to, the drama of living, the drama and the dynamism of struggling with our brokenness is part of the journey of sainthood. And it's the most exciting part, because it's the only time that we're victorious. You can't be victorious without a battle. It's only in war that victories are won. And so be mindful that we shouldn't try to delete these things. Don't be ashamed of the struggle. If you're struggling with something in your sexuality, in your physique, in your mentality, in your spirituality, these are things that will in the end sanctify you. They have millions of saints before you, and they will millions of saints after you. So find hope and consolation in that. And the second thing is recognize that there is an ideal that we are all called to achieve, but don't be disappointed when that ideal is not achieved immediately. It's in the striving for the ideal that our sainthood is gained. So that's what I would say for people who are struggling with some form of, again, either physical, psychological, or spiritual reality. That's all part of the great adventure that is called being the likeness and image of God, Imago Dei. That's all part of the great adventure of manifesting, becoming an icon of the Trinity. Don't get rid of that. Embrace it, love it. It's going to make you a saint. It makes life full of things that are quite beautiful.
All right. Well, let's turn to the second part here of our discussion. We're going to be talking about the shame culture, especially on the internet. I want to spend a few minutes talking about what it is, what fuels it, and then more importantly, what to do about it, and what to do about it when we're a part of it in some way. Either we're the ones participating in this shaming, or we're the ones being shamed, how to handle it there. I think it's evident to anybody who's spent more than 5 or 10 minutes online that social media has fueled this fire in an unprecedented way.
Yeah.
There's many reasons why that is. I think these tools themselves are shaped in such a way as to facilitate shaming. So you have the power of anonymity, so people can say things online with no repercussions in their real life. They can post things on Twitter without anybody really knowing that they did it, or any repercussions in the offline world. Also, it's just easy to gang up on people online. I'm thinking here particularly of Twitter, because I think this is the worst platform that does it. But there's a phrase called Twitter mob, and for good reason, because it acts in exactly the way an offline mob would do, except it's so much easier to mob people on Twitter than it would be to organize a physical rally at a specific point in a specific time and then mob somebody. But we see this again and again, and the primary goal of a Twitter mob is to shame someone. That's almost always what it boils down to, is to paint this person or this activity or this group in the worst possible light.
Right.
And whenever I see this, and you see it, by the way, in the church a lot too. We're not just talking about the secular culture. This is, I think, endemic in the Catholic culture as well. Go on to Catholic Twitter, go on to Facebook, go in the comments on YouTube or Reddit, even in Catholic forums, and you'll see this attitude, this dynamic at play, that we have to ruthlessly tear apart this person, this group. We see almost people becoming the voice, personifying the voice of the accuser, saying what the accuser is telling us within our own minds and hearts, but now saying it publicly. Have you noticed this, or am I crazy in thinking this is more prevalent today or within the last generation than ever before?
You're not crazy, and I'm going to go on Twitter right now and say Brandon Vaught, at Brandon Vaught, crazy, lunatic, right? So, I mean, you're absolutely correct. Now, this is one of the most inherent flaws of technology in general. The fact that technology in and of itself, in the very way that it exists, disembodies the person. So it takes away the incarnate aspect of reality. And that is why it's so much easier to disagree with someone over the internet, even through an email. I've noticed that a lot with conflict in workplaces. Even here at the parish, sometimes when someone has a problem, they just email me. I'm like, I'm 2 offices down. Come talk to me. What is this? Well, it's this technology gives you this sense of security that's really false. that's really false. And you could just sit there and just type up an email, or you could just send a tweet, or you can send a private Facebook message, and you feel big, you feel courageous then. But when you have to look the person in the eye, when you have to face the incarnate reality of another human being, it really changes your mind. There are several philosophers that have written that also about warfare, actually, that's quite interesting. Medieval warfare versus modern technological warfare, because it's one thing to be able to shoot someone 10 miles away, but it's a whole other thing to have to look your enemy in the eye face to face and have that sort of nitty-gritty combat. And that's why there was a much greater aversion to the war in the past than in the present. But that's a side note for another podcast on history. All that to say, you're absolutely correct. And it's very dangerous. And there are several vices that I've noticed, at least, that have really arisen from this kind of internet shame culture. Number one is cowardice. Cowardice is not a Christian virtue. It's a very evil thing to be a coward, to be a yellow belly. And a lot of people are. A lot of people, in the end, they're not really brave what they have to say, or they're not secure in what they have to say, and so they're not willing to really meet the person, to speak with the person, or to engage the person authentically. We cannot promote cowardice. If you have something to say, be brave. Courageousness is a virtue of the Spirit, it's a gift of the Spirit. Look that person in the eye and talk to them about it. Don't be passive aggressive. Don't talk about it behind their back. If you really have an issue, with charity, with love, never with violence, never with vulgarity, with charity, with honesty and love, sit down with the person face to face and say, this is what I'm struggling with. If we had more of that, we have a lot less people hurt in the social media field. The other one, of course, is judgmentalism. Do not judge lest ye be judged. We do this so easily through social media, and we either make a positive judgment or a negative judgment on someone after seeing one Instagram post. Well, just because someone's feeding kitties on Instagram doesn't mean they're a great person. Just because someone takes advantage of a photo op, helping an orphan somewhere, doesn't mean that they're a great Christian. You really don't know the person. You're just getting a brief insight into them. So you can't make whole judgment calls about someone's existence just because of how they look on Instagram or a post that they put on Facebook. Then you have imprudence. Imprudence is probably, I think, the most dangerous social media shame culture vice, meaning Facebook, Twitter, these are not the appropriate places to have deep theological, philosophical, anthropological, or personal exposés. Facebook is not the place to post the deepest, darkest secrets of your soul. Instagram is not the place to share and to debate on deep philosophical aspects of human existence. You just see this incoherent kind of argumentation that goes back and forth between especially celebrities nowadays on tweets, that it just fascinates me that they talk about something as complicated as sociopolitics or as economics or racism in just 200 words or less. And they're trying to really go back at each other on them. Like, this is such a more nuanced intellectual conversation. We can't just frame shot this. So it's very imprudent also to speak about certain things in that context. Social media is made for short, stimulating, kind of transmissions. They're not made for these deeper aspects of human nature. And then the last two, I think actually you could speak to a lot better, Brandon, because you've had some personal experience with it, and I think we both witnessed it, especially as leaders in the Catholic Church. But that would be defamation and calumny. So I mean, I would love to sort of hear your perspective on that, especially being you're the digital media Catholic guru in that sense, So I'm sure you've seen that a lot.
Oh yeah, we'll have to save that for another episode, because I think you and I were planning an episode anyway on slander and calumny, which I think are the grave sins. Catechism describes them as grave sins, which means if you commit them knowingly, it's a mortal sin. Okay, so these are things that if you slander somebody, that could keep you out of heaven. That's how serious these things are. But I think they're some of the most under-discussed, noticed sins today, especially online. I see it every day. I see slander, calumny all over the place, including and especially within Catholic circles. So we need to address that. But again, maybe we'll do it on another podcast. I want to stick with the shame focus here, and also get your thoughts on the link between shame and scapegoating. So there's been a lot of good work done over the last generation, especially by the philosopher René Girard, who wrote the famous book, The Scapegoat. He looked at the scapegoating dynamic in the Gospels in relation to Christ's crucifixion, which he sees as the par excellence instance of scapegoating, where you have all the anger, the sin of the world concentrated on one person, and then he absorbs it and exposes it. But Girard says, and here you're psychoanalyzing contemporary culture, that scapegoating effect is so prevalent, addictive, alluring. And again, I want to emphasize this, the social media world facilitates the scapegoating phenomenon better than any other technology in history, I think. And again, here's how scapegoating works. You find some particular person or group or cause, not really important what it is. What matters most is that you can rally enough hatred and angst around it so that you can create this mob through which you can pour out all of your rage and anger and problems and issues onto that thing. Again, whether it's a person, group, cause, whatever. And by doing so, there's a cathartic release within you, that you feel like, sort of like the Jewish people of the Old Testament, that when they had a scapegoat, this is where the term comes from, the biblical case of an actual goat, where you place your hands on the goat and symbolically, but in some weird way, literally, your sins are imparted to that goat. That goat is sent off into the wilderness to carry your sins away or to die. And in doing that, you're getting rid of your sins. You are in some way improving yourself. So that biblical dynamic, which has religious and spiritual roots and importance, has somehow become so prevalent in the secular online world. But the point I'm trying to make is those two things are vastly different. And
yes.
What happens more often than not in the secular online world is not the authentic release of sin, but the encouragement of sin and vice, that participating in this scapegoating mob online by shaming somebody else, by piling on the shame, the angst, the rage of the world, is not a cathartic release. What it's actually doing is inflaming the problem. That's actually adding more sin to yourself rather than relinquishing it. So if you're tempted to go online and find some cause, it's always the other, the other political party, the other group, the other person with whom I disagree, and I shame them by scapegoating them, you're actually doing more damage to yourself than anybody else, because now you're adding this sin of shame-mongering, this sin of slander and calumny, and again, making the situation more harrowing for yourself.
Yeah, scapegoating is always a substitute for personal conversion and intellectual subtlety. Always a substitute for personal conversion and intellectual subtlety. What do I mean by that? The first thing that we are called to change in this world is ourselves. That's, if you really want to see the world to be a better, more beautiful place, you need to become a saint. And that's always been the response of the church. The response of the church to crisis, the response of the church to tragedy is saints. We see that over and over and over again. Men and women who choose to follow Jesus Christ radically and who without compromise express his divine mercy and love. That's always the proper response. But also intellectual subtlety. Cancel culture is a wonderful example of scapegoating. People who will latch on to a single failure or a single person or a single ideology without doing their due diligence of proper research and understanding that reality or that person, or by minimalizing, diminuting that person to a single failure or mistake that they made in their past. It's entirely disingenuous, completely unacceptable, and it's degrading to human dignity. We cannot look at other human persons or ideas that way. If we really want to contradict an idea, we just can't say this is a dumb idea. Why? Oh, because it's evil. Well, that's not a reason. You haven't given me anything. What can we have an actual conversation about why you think this should be canceled? Why you think this is evil? Can you give me the philosophical reasons, the theological reasons? Can you provide some sort of substance? Why is this a threat to you? But those kind of conversations are no longer happening in society. So now it becomes the Nietzschean will to power. That's what everything is now. Whoever screams the loudest gets to take home the cake. And we see that very prevalent nowadays, and we cannot let that fly. We just cannot let that fly. And that's why right now there is such a battle even for something like free speech. It's not so much even a political battle. That's a God-given right to people to express ideas and thoughts. That's very, very important for us as human beings. And you've seen that even before the foundation of the United States and the church. The times when the church progresses the most, when she goes most deeply into the mysteries of the faith, is at the the contentious arguments of the councils, where bishops are punching each other out and they're arguing and they're talking about these passionate subjects where they're really trying to muscle through the truth. They're trying to understand what is reality? Why do I feel these sentiments as a person? What's actually happening here? And it's not sufficient just to say, well, that's evil because I don't like it, so I want to make it be quiet. We have to really look and evaluate and pray through these things. So scapegoating can never be a legitimate response. And also, it will never take the place of the splinter in your brother's eye because of the beam in yours. You taking out the splinter, even pointing out the splinter in your brother's eye, will never remove the beam from your own eye. You got to take out your beam first. It's as simple as that. And then we can, of course, there are injustices that need to be addressed. I don't disagree with that. There are places where we need to grow and progress as a people, as a society, as a civilization. I don't disagree with that. But if we start off on the foot of just pointing fingers and scapegoating, we're never going to really go, because by the time we get to the end, everything's going to be burnt to the ground, And so we really have to be prudent about how we move forward with those kinds of activities.
All right, let's wrap up with this final topic of what to do when you yourself are feeling shamed. I don't only mean online. Certainly this is true of anybody with a public presence. If you're, a well-known person in whatever circle or niche you float in, you're bound to attract criticism, scapegoating, slander, and probably shame. People telling you how what you're doing is so wrong, you're a terrible person, But not just that. What about those cases, and all of us experience this, so this is generally applicable, where some hidden shortcoming or fault of yours is exposed, others know about it, and they're shaming you for it. If someone sits down with you in spiritual direction, Father Blake, and is wrestling with how do I respond to being shamed, what would you say?
Yeah. There are two responses. One is spiritual and one is practical. On the spiritual level, my dear brothers and sisters, we have to be very careful about where we receive our affirmation and sense of dignity. It cannot come from the world around us. It cannot. And it can't even come from yourself. That's why I disagree with this whole egotistical mentality nowadays, like, just do you, look in the mirror and say, you're the most important person in the world. You're the best. It's like, that also runs dry eventually. There are a lot of people who do that who end up being unhappy. You can't just be affirmed by yourself. You can't be affirmed by the world around you. Do not look for affirmation from Facebook, from Twitter, from Instagram. If you want true, legitimate sense of worth, if you want a true, legitimate sense of purpose, sense of dignity, sense of affirmation, you can only receive that from Jesus Christ. And that's what I work on with all my spiritual directees, first and foremost, is to get them rooted in the foundation of Jesus Christ, not even rooted in me as their spiritual director. Father Blake cannot give you what your heart desires. I cannot. I'm a nice guy. I think I'm an okay, good priest. I still can't give you what your heart longs for, because your heart doesn't long for Father Blake. It longs for Christ. It longs for the fulfillment in the Lord. So I can't just give you myself. I'm not the center. Rather, Jesus is. And the same is true for any of these social media platforms or any of your friends or any of your relationships. If you feel people trying to shame you or you're personally ashamed, that will only be dispelled by turning towards the Sacred Heart of Christ. And that's why I say, along with St. Faustina, run to the confessional. That's where you're going to receive your affirmation. When you fall on your knees and you admit in the full light of truth, this is what I've done, and then you hear those wonderful words, through the ministry of the church, may God grant you pardon and peace. See, that's a freedom that we can't make and no one else can give us. That's a freedom that can only come from Christ and his church, and that's what we're really looking for. So step one would be to protect ourselves from being debilitated by shame. We have to be rooted in Christ and Christ alone. We can't look for satisfaction or a sense of worth from anybody else. Now, on a practical level, there are a few things you can do, and I'm sure you can jump in on this one too, Brandon, as far as what you've done in your own life. I know you've made several really, really big decisions, especially with your ministry and what you do with social media outreach, in order to just practically remove yourself from this toxic mentality. But number one is get off of social media, people. Having a Facebook is not necessary to human existence and happiness. I did not read that anywhere in Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Augustine, that this is necessary for the fulfillment of all human desire. You don't have to have social media. That's not something that you need to have. And if you're in a place where you're not really able to deal with it that well, and that's okay, people are in different places, just get off of it. your life will probably be a lot more beautiful and happy with that. So that's one thing I tell some people. And even for penances, for example, in confession, sometimes if someone's struggling with this, my penance will be, well, go a month without Facebook, or go 2 weeks without watching any news. Get away from media. Just be with Christ. The second thing is ignore. You don't have to respond to every single comment or every single message that's sent to you. Brandon, I know you and I both, we have to do this regularly. As a priest alone, and on top of that, as a social media personality, as sort of like an outreach person, I will get tons of messages, emails. Thank God 99% of them are very supportive, positive, inquisitive. They're looking for the truth. But every once in a while, I'll get an email or get a Facebook message, pretty nasty, saying, Father, I disagree with that. I don't like how you say that. I can't believe that you like Vatican II, whatever it might be. And what do? I can't give it the light of day, because this accusation isn't affirming the truth of Christ. And I'm not going to give it undue diligence. Now, if someone's legitimately asking me a question, of course, I answer that. I don't mind people disagreeing with me. That's important. But if someone's just being vicious, if someone's being mean, being ignorant, I have no obligation to respond to that, because then I could also put myself in the occasion for sin. So same thing for all of us. It's okay to ignore. That's sometimes a very prudent thing to do. And that leads to the last one, which is prudence. Prudence is knowing when and how to do something. When and how to do something. Not everything is worth posting. Not everything is worth saying. Some things definitely should not be said, and some things should definitely not be posted. Okay? And so that's something else that I would take for you all to pray about. Again, Facebook is not the place to post the latest thing that you spoke about in the confession, or it's not the place to post your biggest, deepest, darkest secrets. It could be misused and abused in that place. The proper place to do that is, of course, in the confessional with the priest. But as the famous theologian once said, the technology has now become the replacement for the confessional, and so has the psychologist couch, and it's a pretty shoddy replacement. It won't satisfy you as much as the confessional will. So people now take to social media, and they take to their counselors and psychologists to replace their need for reparation and healing of Christ in the church. And it doesn't work. So be prudent about where you go, what you're sharing, and what you're doing. So those would be sort of my 3 practical pieces of advice. I don't know if you can add anything to that, Brandon.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've learned a lot of lessons over the years in this regard. One of them is, there's the old adage that hurt people, right? That it's people with the deepest wounds that try most aggressively to wound other people. I think you could probably say the same thing about shame, that ashamed people shame people. And so I've come to realize that a lot of times when you see the most aggressive attempts at shaming online, it's often the case, I'd hesitate to go beyond that or say it's almost always the case, but it's often the case that those people themselves are deeply wounded or ashamed about something in their life. And at the risk of psychoanalyzing the general populace, often they avoid addressing their own shame by shaming others. That if I can show how horrible this other person is, it makes me look a little better relative to them. So that principle has helped me a lot, and it's helped me to become easier and nonchalant and more breezy about any attempted shaming that comes my way. If you can almost feel pity toward the other person. That's not arrogance, but to feel pity toward them, that there's probably some wound or some issue or some shame that this person's dealing with that's motivating their attempt to shame me. So that's a practical step. Also, I think I learned this from you. I'd often come to you and say, oh man, I'm so frustrated about, this person or this group and what they've said about me. And it's really disturbing me. They've said I'm this, that, the other. The first question you always ask me is that true? And it's such a simple question, but so disarming. And I think it's more helpful to hear it from another person. It's harder to ask yourself that question, but when another person asks you, yeah, but is that true? And 99 times out of 100, the answer is, no, I guess not.
Right.
Well, okay, then. Well, then stop right there. Like, why are you believing this? Why are you giving it the time of day? If you've recognized this is a lie, that this is not true, why be concerned about it? But then another question, I can't remember if I got this from you or elsewhere, but a follow-up question. Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is, well, yeah, you do have that fault, or you are guilty of that, bad character flaw. The second question is that the way Jesus sees you? Is that the way Jesus would speak about you? And in that case, almost 100 times out of 100, the answer is no. That even if you were dealing with this shortcoming, sin, flaw, the way that other people on earth would address that in you and try to shame you about it is not the way Christ would address it, is not the way Christ would see that. Think back to everything we just said in this episode about how, Christ sees your wounds and sins and shortcomings as beautiful, not because they're intrinsically good, but because they're an opportunity for grace. And he sees how you're going to transcend those things through his help. And so those two questions for me have always got me out of dwelling on shame and being obsessed with what other people are saying about me. Recognizing that shamed people shame people. Also asking yourself the question, or having somebody else, an objective friend or third party, say, is what they're saying about you true? And then is that the way Christ sees you? Or is that the way Christ would speak about, those aspects of your personality or your identity? So those have been helpful for me.
And ultimately what that does, again, going back to our podcast on spiritual woundedness, is that it roots you back in reality. Remember that what Satan hates the most is reality, because that's where Jesus lives. So his only goal is to get you to live in a realm of fantasy. That's always what the enemy's trying to do. And social media is a great advocate for that. When you have someone reduce your entire personality to a single post that you made, that's pretty fantasy. That is ridiculous. You are so much more than a post that you've made. You're so much more than a book that you've written. You're so much more than something that you've said on the phone. You're more than that. There's so much more to who you are as a human person. And everyone needs to take, it's really obligated on us as human beings, as brothers and sisters in Christ, to give people their due diligence. That's what we call justice, to give everyone their due. But so when someone doesn't give you that due, there's one person who always will, Jesus Christ. He knows you inside and out. So get back to reality again. And that's why I would ask you those two questions, Brandon. I ask those to anybody that would come to me in spiritual direction or what have you. I always say, is it true? Is that what Jesus thinks? Is it true? Is that what Jesus thinks? Those two questions get you rooted right back in reality. And all of a sudden, this thing that was so big and so heavy and so overwhelming is like, just dissipates. And you're thinking, I cannot believe I didn't sleep last night thinking about that stupid thing, and I'm going to sleep like a baby tonight. Chesterton, again, our wonderful witty friend, he said, among the most Christian activities is to get a good night's sleep. And what he means by that, of course, is when you sleep, it's an act of faith in the end. You really do become quite vulnerable. Anything could happen to you in your sleep. But for those who know that they're in the hands of Christ, those who know that everything in the end will turn out fine because they're in the Lord, they sleep like rocks. And so needless to say, I sleep like a rock every night. I slept through, we had a tropical storm come through the state of Florida here recently. I didn't even wake up. So I slept through the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, there's just that lightheartedness, that joy that comes with being rooted in the reality of who you are in Jesus Christ is immeasurable.
All right, well, I think we'll tie it to a close here. Again, we've been talking about dealing with shame. We spent the first half of the discussion discussing shame in the spiritual life, how to deal with the sin of shame, its connections to the sense of guilt, its connection to the confessional. And then we shifted more to the cultural level, the general level of the shame culture prevalent online and how to respond to being shamed. Father Blake, is there anything about shame we haven't yet covered that you want to mention here before we close?
Just to reiterate the necessity of reconciliation. Please, my dear brothers, sisters, my dear sons and daughters, avail yourself to the grace of the sacrament of reconciliation as much as humanly possible. I go once a month. It's not because I'm out robbing banks at night, okay? And I'm not a vigilante either, as much as I do love Batman. It's because I need the grace. I need to be reminded every once in a while, even if I just have the simplest of sins, I just need to be reminded that Christ loves me. And that's the ultimate act of reconciliation, to once a month go and to say, Lord, here is my shame. Here's where I allowed the enemy to convince me that I'm wicked, the enemy to lie to me and say that I don't deserve you or I don't deserve a happy life. I just need those lies to be renounced in my soul. And to hear the priest raise his hands over you and to absolve your sins, that's the ultimate renunciation of shame. That's the ultimate freedom. That's the ultimate way that Christ looks at you and says, be not ashamed, but rather come to me, Do you not believe that I prepared a house for you? That beautiful gospel from John. Do you not believe that I have prepared a house for you? Let not your hearts be troubled. Do you doubt me, or do you believe in me? For I am the way, the truth, and the life. So let us continue turning to Christ. Let us trust in his divine mercy to free us from our shame and to allow us to live in the joy of his grace.
Well, thanks to all of you for watching, for listening, for emailing us, for commenting, for sharing, all that you do to encourage this podcast and the discussions that we have on it. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time on the Burroughshire Podcast.